everyone. I'm Shannon Van Sant, an advisor to the Committee for Freedom and Hong Kong Foundation. Today, the CFHK Foundation is releasing a new report on Hong Kong's central role in facilitating the transfer of money and restricted technology to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. These are three countries that the international community has sanctioned. In our report titled Beneath the Harbor, Hong Kong's Leading Role in Sanctions Evasion, Sam Bickett, who is here with us today, details growing trade between Hong Kong and sanctioned countries, and the city's key role in providing Russia dual-use technology for its war in Ukraine. Using publicly available data collected by C4ADS, a Washington, D.C.-based global security nonprofit, and other open source data and corporate records, Sam highlights Hong Kong's actions which undermine sanctions and threaten global security and stability. Here with us to discuss this today is Sam, the report's author. He is a lawyer, advocate, and researcher specializing in Hong Kong human rights and democracy. Sam was previously a corporate sanctions and corruption lawyer in Hong Kong for nearly a decade before being imprisoned on false charges amidst the 2019 protest. He was deported in 2022. Sunny Chung is an associate fellow for China Studies and deputy editor of China Brief at the Jamestown Foundation. He is also an International Strategic Forum Fellow at the Special Competitive Studies Project. Olivia Enos is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute working on human rights and national security challenges in Asia. She is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown, a contributor at Forbes, and adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum. She received her bachelor's from Patrick Henry College and master's in Asian Studies from Georgetown University. So Sam, I'll start with you. What sparked your research on these topics, and can you describe the journey of finding the data and the research that you found?
And thank you everyone for being here. And I first want to just thank the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong for making this report possible. In particular, Shannon and Mark Clifford over there, as well as Francis Wei and Grace Young, who have spent many late nights making this report look better than it would and accessible to people to read. And so it's been really a pleasure to put this together. So this report started, we started looking at it late last year. What became clear is that there were various reports out there showing that Hong Kong had some involvement in Russian sanctions evasion and North Korean sanctions evasion, Iranian sanctions evasion. We knew from our work, specializing in Hong Kong, that this was a much bigger problem than had really been reported out there. We had talked to policymakers about it before, and really the message was, we think that's probably true too, but we don't have the evidence. We need to see it. And that's how this report came together. Hong Kong has been in the news a lot in the last couple of years for the breakdown of rule of law, for human rights issues. But ultimately, when it comes to global interests, that's a tragedy. But the world acts when they see global stability and global security interests threatened. And this is an issue where we needed to be able to come and say, that's what Hong Kong is doing now. They are playing a concerted role in this effort to destabilize the global order. And I think that I expected to find a lot. I was shocked still at how much we found. There's no question to me, and I think this report shows very clearly that when you've got China getting closer to Russia, you've got Russia getting closer to North Korea, you've got Iran building drones and shipping them to Russia and to the Houthis and places like that. Those are all a bunch of allies who are working together, but Hong Kong is the hub. So you've got other sanctions evaders in the world, but nothing like Hong Kong. Part of that is its drift from the West and from the global order politically. Part of that, frankly, is just its geographic location. It's in a really convenient place for all of this to happen, whether it's shipping to North Korea, whether it's shipping over to Russia or down to Iran. And then, of course, it's right next to China, which is coordinating a lot of these activities. So that's how all of this started. And I hope everyone will read the report, and that we're certainly hoping to make some advocacy recommendations and make a difference here in how the world is looking at Hong Kong.
Now, all three of you have written and spoken extensively about the decline in freedom and rule of law in Hong Kong. And Sam, let me ask you, how does the decline in freedoms we see in Hong Kong, the decline in rule of law and international norms, how does that relate to Hong Kong's rise as a center of illicit finance? And how does this reflect a real shift in government policy there?
So it is all connected, right? Let me give one example of, a very clear connection here. The sanctions on Ukraine, legally, officially not adopted by China, by Hong Kong, right? But the sanctions on North Korea, there are UN sanctions on North Korea. Hong Kong, by treaty and by law, by domestic law, is supposed to enforce those sanctions. Where there's rule of law, that's done independently by prosecutors. They would be enforcing against these sanctions evaders and making sure that happens. We've gone into court records, into corporate records. I can find no evidence that in recent years Hong Kong has actually been enforcing its own law with regard to North Korean sanctions imposed by the UN. And this is a problem with China as well. That has to be a political decision, and it has to be a political dictate that's handed down from above, where they say don't enforce the law. And that is, by definition, the erosion of rule of law. But more broadly than that, you're seeing how just the drift from the global order is making a big difference here. So, for example, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority used to recommend that Hong Kong companies enforce global sanctions, US sanctions, EU sanctions. They don't do that anymore. We know that the Chinese government, Chinese regulators have basically come in to Hong Kong, sat down with financial officials and said to them, you can't do this anymore. We saw it also with other areas where there used to be a requirement when you listed in Hong Kong that you had to list out your risks for China. And now they don't do that anymore. So investors aren't getting disclosures anymore if they list, if the company lists in Hong Kong about what is clearly a risk of political instability in China or political whims in China. So there's a lot of ways in which all of this sort of creeps together: political, legal, and the crackdown on human rights is all sort of stemming from this same idea that we no longer, as a city, see ourselves as part of the global rule of law and order.
And I will also point out, in October 2022, Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee specifically said he would not enforce global sanctions on Russia. And speaking of Russia, Sam, you found really interesting customs data about exports from Hong Kong to Russia in the year after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Can you go into a bit more detail on that?
Yeah, I think if you're a busy person and you want to have a good story in this report, and I think the best parts of the report are the case studies. There's some really wild stuff in there, and I think we'll talk about some of them. But at the macro level, there are some statistics that we pulled together that are really quite remarkable, and some of which haven't really been reported before. So the EU and the US have a list. It's called the Common High Priority Items List. This is basically a list of categories of goods, technology, that Russia most needs for its war effort. So a lot of them are semiconductors, things like communications equipment, stuff that's really used in weapons, high-tech weapons, in high-tech military communications gear. It's a list you can find online. So we took those items with the help of C4ADS data, and we kind of assessed them. There's a massive number of shipments, but we looked a lot, as you'll see in the report, at December 2023 data. In that month, which we used as a snapshot, 40% of goods shipped from Hong Kong were common high priority items. 40%, $750 million worth of goods shipped to Russia. That's really extraordinary. So that it's really hard for them to claim that this isn't a concerted effort to try to fund the war effort. Another piece of evidence on that, another important data point, After the war started in February of 2022, Hong Kong shipments to Russia of these same CHPL items dropped very low. So in March, they were down, I think, at about $100,000 total or something like that. That happened in March, it happened in April. By May, they shot up. And by the end of the year, they were higher than they'd ever been. So what you see there is that at first, Hong Kong, and for whatever reason, was saying, okay, maybe we will enforce these sanctions, and maybe we will want to not support this war. But somewhere around the spring, a political decision was made, not just to ignore the sanctions, but to actively step in and try to fund and support the war effort.
Sammy, let me turn to you. You've done some fascinating research on Beijing's military-civil fusion policy and dual-use goods for the Jamestown Foundation. And you've also done research on the innovation that's happening in that regard in Hong Kong and in that region. Can you describe that a bit and how that represents a change from the past?
Sure. First of all, let me thank for having me, and then congrats on the big report by Sam. It's very well written. And then based on my previous research on how China using Hong Kong as part of the economic statecraft strategy, I think we have been noticing how Hong Kong has been colluding with some of the China allies for a while. So one very quick example is that several years ago, when we heard about the Chinese naval development and then a modernization, and then people were worried about that. But very few people noticed that actually the first aircraft carrier by the PLA Navy was actually a Ukrainian, a former Soviet Union model aircraft carrier, Liaoling Hao. And then there's some Chinese businessmen, in order to circumvent some weapon control from Europe to China, they set up some cell companies in Hong Kong, and they try to portray that aircraft carrier from Ukraine, and then ship that to Hong Kong, pretending that they will try to redesign that aircraft carrier into some overseas casino, something like that. However, it's not true. And because later we see that that aircraft carrier was further shipped to Shenzhen and was rebuilt into the first aircraft carrier for the PLAN. So I think this is a very good example to see that how China has been using Hong Kong in order to circumvent this kind of weapon controls, in order to amplify and achieve their military modernization. And secondly, I will also say that over the years, we see that the loss of political autonomy of Hong Kong, right? But very few people discern actually is also the loss of Hong Kong economic autonomy, because Hong Kong has been absorbed by the Chinese government in the Greater Bay Area scheme. And this scheme further allow Chinese government or even the Guangdong province to have the power to override some policy of Hong Kong. So at that period of time, Hong Kong is no longer Hong Kong. They are not serving the interests of 7 million Hong Kong people, but serving the national interest and strategy of the CCP. So by this Greater Bay Area scheme, for example, they treat Hong Kong also as a hub in order to purchase all the goods and semiconductors and different kind of being embargo materials from Hong Kong to further to the other places in the Greater Bay Area. I think this is also another very alarming phenomenon that people seldomly are aware. So I would encourage each of you, of course, to read this report, but at the same time to consider Hong Kong not just as a human rights violation and abuse example, but as part of the broader China national strategy in order to understand the whole the value of Hong Kong as an international financial hub.
Olivia, I'm going to ask you now, in terms of Beijing's alliance with autocratic states, growing alliance, it seems. Beijing has advocated for a long time for a multipolar world. Some have talked about a growing China-Russia axis, an axis of chaos. Xi and Putin have met more than 40 times, I believe. How do the findings of this report, how do they fit in with the context of Beijing's shifting relationships and growing partnerships even with some of these autocratic countries?
Yeah, before I get into that, I just wanted to say, Sam, Huge congratulations on this incredible report. I think for those of us who have been working in the human rights community on the Hong Kong issue for a long time, we've been warning about the implications of rule of law, not just on the civil and political liberties side of things, but the implications for illicit activities and for making Hong Kong a much more difficult place to do business. Your report does the hard work and answers the questions about why Hong Kong is not a place where it's business as usual anymore. And it does that by showing just the extent and the nature of the illicit activities that are going on. So I hope that anybody who is going to pick up this report today and in the future realizes that the consistent arguments that we get out of Washington and capitals around the globe that degradations in the human rights and in the rule of law don't have implications for foreign policy are just completely overturned, because I think this report truly does that. So sorry, I wanted to say that. But on the question at hand, Beijing is going around and it's taking a page out of the US and the free world's playbooks. When we think about alliances, typically, we think about freedom-loving, rule of law, human rights respecting places. And what we see now is not just Beijing, but Russia and North Korea saying, we're going to take our own model and put our own spin on it. And we're going to have alliances as well. But it's not going to be alliances of the traditional, line that we're used to. Rather than rights respecting and rule of law, et cetera, you're going to have lawbreakers, you're going to have sanctions evaders, and you're going to have human rights abusers who are all coming together in order to pose a very, very serious threat to global order. And I think that Hong Kong is now playing, a central role in that. I wanted to raise a couple of ways that we see Beijing doing this. Obviously we've seen just an incredible number of meetings between Beijing and Moscow. We have also seen North Korea signing a mutual defense treaty with Russia that the North Koreans themselves consider to be an actual alliance. And then, of course, China was, for the longest time, North Korea's only ally. And so we see this tightening and tightening together, and this becomes more and more significant, more and more substantial in light of the fact that the world is on a knife's edge as Beijing is continuing to act out in ways, for example, in the South China Sea, we just saw in the Philippines, in the Second Thomas Shoal. And all of us are concerned about a potential PLA invasion of Taiwan. And so when we see these alliances tightening and when we see Hong Kong continuing to do the bidding of Beijing in so many ways, we should be worried, because Hong Kong may no longer be the financial center of the free and fair world, but now the bankroller, the evader of sanctions for the unfree world that is posing the greatest threat to long-term stability. So Sam, thank you again. This is such an incredibly important report. Yeah.
Sam, you tracked a number of companies and individuals as part of this report who are doing pretty brazen illicit trading. Can you go into any of these cases that particularly stood out to you?
Yeah, this is my favorite part of the report. I mean, there's just so many wild stories straight out of a movie for some of these. First, I'll say, and I meant to mention this at the beginning, where did we get this information is a question that everybody has. There were a few different sources. The biggest piece, especially on the Russia, but also on some of the others, was from the global data security firm C4ADS. If you haven't checked out C4ADS, they're an NGO that does really incredible work. And if you're interested in some of this stuff, I think it's, a lot of us kind of know that there are human rights organizations and advocacy organizations out there that kind of go towards the front. But in today's world, the importance of data behind all of this stuff is critical. And C4ADS has reports on their website on North Korea, on Hong Kong, on various issues, just kind of saying, we don't need to advocate, here's the data, and you can see it. So I would encourage you to check those out. We also did a lot of work looking into Hong Kong companies' records. The Hong Kong Companies Registry is a fascinating place. As Hong Kong has moved away from transparency, the companies registry has, coincidentally or not, become increasingly difficult to use. It's almost funny that you go in, you can't get bulk data. You have to go through about 10 or 12 screens to get to a single document. You then have to pay individually for that document. You have to enter identifying information about yourself. You have to do all these things. So if you're trying to pull data to try to understand trends or anything like that, it's virtually impossible. But I spent a lot of time just one by one going through and taking out companies' documents, corporate documents, which has been very important. We used satellite data, ship tracking data, and various other sources that were available to us. On some of the Iran stuff, there was a great hacked leak of emails from a front company called Sahara Thunder that we used for some of these. And there's a lot of data sources out there, in particular for people who are looking for a future career in type of this stuff. Look to data, get that skill set. There's just an incredible amount of work that can be done there. I'll just talk about a couple of the case studies. I think to give an example of how wild some of these were, there's a company called Pyroclinos Limited in Hong Kong. This one stood out to us. It was pretty high on the list of CHPL, the Common High Priority Shipments to Russia. And so I started looking into it a little bit. They have a website. The website says that they are a fertilizer distributor and charcoal distributor. You dig into the website a little bit more, and you look at the About Us, and you have nonsense text, lorem ipsum text, right? So it's nothing really real on there. So that raises questions. We then looked at some of the C4ADS data for their shipments. They've never, as far as we can tell, shipped to Russia any sort of fertilizer or anything like that. It's really only this technology type shipments. Their corporate registry documents show owners and directors. And so what we found is that they list owners, shareholders, and directors in various places. They change from year to year. Most of them are in Cyprus or in Central Asia. We found one in particular, I can't pronounce it, but a woman named Katerina Hadjiratsu or something like that. Greek name. We found somebody who is likely her, but we don't know for sure, and that's important to point out, who worked at a corporate services firm with that name in Cyprus. She's a young woman. She is a director for more than 100 different companies in Hong Kong, most of which are completely irrelevant to anything Russia-related. So it's pretty clear that this is somebody who is serving as a front, right? So this corporate services company in Cyprus, which is an EU country, by the way, is then creating fronts for companies to hide who their true owners are. We then looked a little bit further. One of their directors, a guy named Svilin Spasov. Again, we can't verify 100% that the Svilin Spasov we found is the same one that this guy is. That's important to say. But the Svilin Spasov we found, Bulgarian name, was based in Cyprus, director of a few companies in the UK and elsewhere. He worked for a firm, IBFS, in Cyprus. Now, if you went in, when I first went in March to that website, you look at this company, and they say, we have offices in different places. We were founded in Moscow. We have an office in Cyprus. We have an office in Hong Kong and a few others. As we were kind of coming back and fact-checking on this report in June, we went back. Now they say, we have an office in Cyprus. We have an office in Hong Kong. No mention of Russia anymore, right? So I think they realized that someone was onto them. Again, we don't know for sure, speculation. But they removed that for one reason or another. Clearly, this is a corporate services firm that was founded in Russia and now wants to conceal the fact that they were Russia origin. So another piece of that one, so Pyroclinos, you look at the records. They only ship to one company in Russia, and it is a sanctioned company that's been providing these goods to the Russian military according to the US government. VMK. And then the VMK only receives goods from Hong Kong from this company as well. Now, we can't speculate too much for legal reasons, for obvious reasons, but when you have a situation like that, it is certainly raises some questions as to whether there is more connection there than just seller and buyer. and whether there is sort of an operation that's being run through the EU that is all sort of leading back to the same source. So that's pure cleanness. On Iran, there was one that was very interesting, and I think we're going to talk about recommendations a little bit. But one thing that we noted is the U.S. government in particular. We focused on the U.S. government. The EU is obviously relevant here, and others. But the U.S. has really an extraordinary amount of impact when they sanction compared to other countries. So the process for sanctions is too slow. Just no ifs, ands, or buts. It takes months. But from the time that the U.S. government starts trying to pull together evidence to sanction a company for Russia, for Iran, for whatever, to the time they sanction it can take months or even years. Sometimes the U.S. government has sanctioned companies. We found some of these. The company doesn't even exist anymore, and they're still listed on sanctions, right? One company related to this that we found, there was a company called Arctronics that the U.S. government sanctioned. They did not sanction the owner of that company. So you can go into the corporate records. You can see that the owner is a man who lived in Shenzhen along with someone else who probably is a spouse or a family member because they live in the same residential address in Shenzhen. And what they did, you can see in the corporate records, after the sanctions, within days, they filed to dissolve the company. It then takes a few months for the Hong Kong government to actually dissolve the company, but they did it. Within days of the Hong Kong government dissolving this company, the same guy then started a new company called ETS International in Hong Kong. That was earlier this year. As far as we know, the US government isn't aware of it. We don't know, again, I think it's important to say that we don't know what this company is doing, actually. We don't have 2024 data on shipments to Russia. But it really highlights a couple of real problems here. The speed at which these things are done is not fast enough because in a place like Hong Kong, you can dissolve and create a new company in days. Also, the fact that they're not really sanctioning many individuals. You've got to sanction the individuals behind these companies. It's unclear exactly why that's the case, but it seems to be that it's more difficult to establish the necessary evidence on individuals. But to me, that says, okay, well, you've got to put more resources behind establishing that evidence. Because if you don't sanction the individuals, they can start a new company in days. It's the same as the US. I can start a company in Delaware. I can get on my phone right now and do it by the end of this meeting, right, in Delaware. It's just far too easy. And so you've got to adapt to these situations, and we're really not seeing that. And then I think, not to jump into the recommendations, but what this one also shows is, this guy uses the same banks. He uses the same corporate services companies to set up these things and to change companies. We need to sanction the banks. The Biden administration has been threatening to do it for a long time. They refuse to do it. I wouldn't say they refuse to do it, but they haven't done it. And I think a big reason for that is that when you sanction a major bank, a major Chinese bank, it has really big ripples across the world. But so does the war in Ukraine. You've got to make a decision, okay, we're going to do this. Second, corporate services companies, BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, which handles export control, they did recently list some addresses of corporate services companies that are now sanctioned, those addresses. So even if the company changes its name, it's a good step. It doesn't really solve the problem. It's not too hard to move across town, right? So there's more that needs to be done there. And I'll just stop there for now.
Sure. Olivia, you've written extensively about human rights abuses in North Korea. How does this issue of illicit finance, sanctions evasion, how does it relate to human rights abuses in a place like North Korea?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why does North Korea engage in sanctions evasion in the first place? The reason generally is to enrich the regime and to continue its weapons development. And obviously, those weapons pose a threat, not just to geographic US, but also to other parts of the world. That alone is, I know it's a security threat, but it's also a human rights threat as well. And what we know of the regime is that they continually enrich themselves through a variety of different means, and that they view both the weapons program and their human rights violations as two sides of the same coin. This was actually a phrase that was used by Jung Pak, who is the former East Asia Pacific Bureau Deputy Assistant Secretary in her fabulous book, Becoming Kim Jong-un. But she's right. They're two sides of the same coin because the Kim regime uses the weapons program and its human rights violations for the same purpose, to maintain its grip on power. And as the regime continues to enrich itself, and in the case of Hong Kong, the way that Hong Kong is helping to facilitate sanctions evasion in North Korea, specifically through ship-to-ship transfers. And your report goes into that in great detail. But those ship-to-ship transfers enrich the regime with much-needed resources that they cannot get through other means, usually coal, but also other related things. And the regime diverts all of those resources towards itself and away from the people. So as the people continue to get poorer, the regime continues to get richer, and it's a cycle that perpetuates itself and ultimately ends up strengthening the Kim regime. So this is, one of the ways that we see this as worsening the human rights conditions in North Korea. But I think this is true for many regimes too. North Korea really typifies this because it's one of the worst places on earth from a human rights standpoint. But I think many of the regimes that engage in sanctions evasion also just choose to forsake caring for their people and allow those individuals to just not enjoy any of the basic liberties that we really hold dear in the free world.
I have to jump in and jump on that and mention one of the particular case studies called we tracked a ship called the New Conch. So one thing I mentioned at the beginning that UN or North Korea is unique in the three countries that we looked at because there are UN sanctions. There's a UN sanctions committee that for many years has released annual reports and interim reports, so really 2 reports a year that are really incredible actually, where they have satellite photos of ships just floating around the sea, ghost ships that are doing ship-to-ship transfers with North Korea, back and forth, getting North Korea money, getting them goods in exchange for money. And they name these ships. They name the ships. They name the Hong Kong companies and companies elsewhere that are responsible for this, that own these ships and manage these ships. And they call on member states, and they say member states, but what do they mean here? They mean China, because it's China and Hong Kong, to crack down and to seize these ships. And China and Hong Kong simply haven't done it. So the New Conch, has laundered its identity multiple times. So it was called the F-Lawn line for a while. It had a few other names. These where you basically take a ship, you list it in the global registry as retired, but then you just or you retire the ship, but then you just shift the name to another ship, and this allows it to go. But they're still traceable. It's been revealed by the UN repeatedly. Not only have Hong Kong and China done nothing to stop this, but recently, a couple months ago, Russia and China voted to disband the committee that was revealing these. Again, this isn't an optional thing. This is a treaty obligation of China and Hong Kong to crack down on these sanctions evaders, and they're refusing to do it.
Yeah, and I would just
working to stop it.
I would just add that I will say this was one area where Hong Kong was not entirely evading U.S. attention, because Hong Kong, I believe, has specific entities in Hong Kong have faced some sanctions over engaging in the ship-to-ship transfers, but I would argue not enough since it continues today.
You mean the U.S. sanctions?
That the U.S. has sanctioned,
yeah.
But I think there's definitely a need for greater international attention to this, and as you've mentioned, a lot of EU countries are now involved too, but the EU is typically on its back foot when it comes to engaging on the sanctions-related front. So hopefully this is kind of a wake-up call for them as well.
So for each of you, I'd love to hear one solution, your top solution for this issue of Hong Kong as emerging as a sanctions evasion hub. We'll start with you, Sam.
Sanction the banks. We have a list of multiple recommendations, and we stand by all of them, and we'll push for all of them. But the easiest thing that the administration and the U.S. could do, and the EU right now, is sanction banks that we know are financing a lot of this stuff. On that front, as we were preparing this report, we know that the administration is saying that they have some materials suggesting that Hong Kong's shipments to Russia have dropped somewhat in 2024, in the first few months of 2024 through April. I wouldn't be surprised by that. I have some skepticism about it because I think that we'd likely find that shipments across the world of these common high priority items have somewhat reduced as Russia has gotten what they need. But to the extent that the administration tries to say that, they're reducing it some, we're not going to sanction the banks, it's a small reduction. It's still a massive problem. And we're seeing no real signs that there's been any kind of crackdown on this by China, by Hong Kong. And it simply needs to happen. To be clear, you don't have to sanction every bank that's doing this. If you sanction one bank, there will be ripples for that one bank, but every other bank, which are all extremely reliant on the US financial system and on US dollar clearing, will start to comply, and they won't finance this anymore.
Cool, and I totally agree with Sam, and then I have one more suggestion to add on, which is regarding, I think the US government should really work closely with international partners and mainly international platform. So when we talk about international financial intelligence network sharing, there are two major groups, which is one, the ICMAN group, and the second one is the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. And regarding the ICMAN group, is actually part of the global financial intelligence network, and the Treasury FinCEN is actually part of that. And Hong Kong is also part of that. And for the FATF, it's actually established by the G7 in 1989, and it's actually also another global network trying to combat the financial intelligence network. And Hong Kong, interestingly, is also an independent member of that, but Russia was removed last year from this financial intelligence network. I think the reason is simple, because if we consider that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, especially regarding this kind of economic power, and the existence of Hong Kong being in this network is actually also compromising this network. Because every major country will try to share their own domestic intel to those networks and try to urge Hong Kong or other countries try to keep an eye on a specific individual or banks or financial criminal underground system, right? However, if Hong Kong is not trustworthy enough, how can we share this kind of intel to them? I think this is quite worth noting. And then I think for the FinCEN, they definitely, under the Treasury, should play a bigger role in order to oversee this kind of process and try to urge the international platform and allies, try to, first of all, of course, seek Hong Kong government response. But if they deny and try to overlook all this kind of existing problems, I think we have to freest Hong Kong membership in this international financial network. I think that will be a very powerful move in order to stop Hong Kong, in order to assist this kind of behavior endlessly.
Yeah.
Have there been reports that that Hong Kong isn't cooperating with FATF disclosure yet, or is it kind of speculation?
No, I mean, they still work on very normal, daily things regarding counter-terrorism thing. I mean, Hong Kong and other US or even the Five Eyes Alliance, right, regarding this kind of arena. But I mean, in the border area, if we deem that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, and especially when we see that there is continuous violation for Hong Kong government, and then we should really reconsider the membership of Hong Kong in this network. Otherwise, I think it will be heavily compromised.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason why the US is so powerful as a sanctions enforcer is because of the preeminence of the US dollar in the global financial system. And so when Sam is talking about ensuring the enforcement of our initial primary sanctions, and then he's talking about ensuring enforcement of secondary sanctions, the strength of the US dollar is really the reason why we're even able to go around and do this so effectively. But the US financial tools of engagement extend beyond just our primary and secondary sanctions tools. So my top recommendation would be to use a set of tools that Treasury has called the primary money laundering concern designation, and also the special measures that are short of a primary money laundering concern. What is a primary money laundering concern? It's a very scalable solution because obviously you could go full hog and designate the entirety of Hong Kong as a primary money laundering concern. I don't think we're there today that you would designate the entirety of Hong Kong, but you can actually designate specific sets of transactions or specific financial institutions like Chinese banks or Hong Kong banks that are engaging in money laundering, sanctions evasion, all various forms of illicit financial activities. And the reason why I personally like a primary money laundering concern designation is, one, the tool has been used actually fairly sparingly, but when it has been used, as was the case with North Korea over Banco Delta Asia, a Macanese bank that was laundering for the Kim regime, the second that they were labeled as a primary money laundering concern, it had reverberating effects throughout the entire global financial system. Literally, other banks and reputable institutions said, we're not going to touch Banco Delta Asia with a 10-foot pole. And any other sort of reputable financial institution said, we're not going to be engaging with Banco Delta Asia anymore. Not only did it have implications for the global financial system, individuals who are engaged in negotiations with North Korea at that specific time, this was when the six-party talks were going on, got firsthand intel from the North Koreans that it affected their ability to access finances that they were otherwise using to enrich themselves and to develop their nuclear missile programs. So when you see the efficacy of a primary money laundering concern designation and also the scalability of it, I think this would have huge implications, not only for governments thinking about doing business in Hong Kong and the extent to which there are risks from a government and rule of law standpoint, but also to businesses who are continuing to repeat the lie that it is business as usual in Hong Kong and we can continue to operate as normal. So for me, that would be my number one recommendation, but I would also encourage everyone, the reports are over here, please pick one up on the way out if you can, because Sam has like, I don't know, what was it, 8 or 9 different recommendations in the report that really go into great detail on, I think, a really great range of options that the US government and the international community have at their disposal.
So now I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, if you have some for Sam and the other panelists. Sure. Yeah.
I have a long list. Sam, thanks. It looks great. I haven't read it yet. I'm eager to do so. But I wanted to actually ask you a little bit sort of beyond the data that you've been digging into, to the extent that you can talk about what you think was going through.
Sophie.
Oh, sorry. What you think was going through the heads of people who, for example, investors who were seeing, disclosures either fade away or stop entirely or be weaker, or the Hong Kong government officials whose job it had been to try to impose higher standards or make sanctions processes work, or even members of the UN Sanctions Committee who could see the political threat that China and Russia were posing and trying to weaken those systems. I mean, this won't have happened overnight, right? And I'm curious to know, even from your own experience prior to 2023, what you think people's thinking was. Did people think that these were idiosyncratic, somehow time-bound threats? Did they see a bigger problem? How many other people saw this coming, do you think? And what did they do to try to stave it off?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we try to do here is pull together a lot of evidence that we do have some new stuff in there, but we also pull together in the report, things that have already been reported out. Look, I mean, when it comes to investors, everything is a risk-based calculus, right? I mean, they still invest in China, and it's certainly not a place that, I mean, it's certainly a place with a lot of arbitrary sort of things that you can't really rely on, and certainly not much information flow. I think one thing I hope for investors that this report does is shifts that needle somewhat. I call me a cynic, but I don't think you're ever going to convince the corporate world to act on things like this based on values or morals or human rights. They're going to act on whether they think they can make money and whether they think the risk is too high. I think the risk is absolutely too high. And this report shows some of that. And those risks for companies, this report, if nothing else, should show them that the chance of the sanctions regime against Hong Kong vastly expanding in the not too distant future is very high, and that's going to screw up their business in Hong Kong. I think it also should, as we talked about the undermining of rule of law and how that's related to this. There's really just an increasing risk that you're going to see sort of arbitrary enforcement against foreign companies or sort of seizure of assets and things like that, seizure of IP that is really risky as well.
Anyone else?
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Sam, and for your report here. I'm actually looking at your recommendation number 5 out of the 6 recommendations, and I really like this report here. I do observe that out of the 6 recommendations, 5 recommendations are based on governmental measures, while recommendation 5, the 5th one, is based on what corporates should do for the AML procedures. So I happen to be doing a lot of human rights due diligence recently, and I want to thank you for your hard work and going through the Hong Kong corporate registry. It's really difficult. You have to pay for each record here, I understand that. But I think that there have been increasing difficulty in actually conducting a comprehensive human rights due diligence. Like what we do, right? I have an investment firm that exclude, some China, Russia, and things like that. And last year, we actually went to the San Francisco. There's an APEC conference. So we actually have people asking us, how do we conduct a proper human rights due diligence? So my question is that, should we be more like hardliner in terms of really we have to de-risk Hong Kong the same way we are trying to de-risk or decouple China or those sanctioned countries here? So I'm just wondering, do you think based on the increasing difficulty on conducting our proper human rights due diligence, should we just probably just, hey, do not invest in Hong Kong anymore or divest from it? What do you think?
I can talk about, recommendation 5 for a minute first, and then anybody else can chime in. Recommendation 5 is pretty technical. Banks have what's called know your customer requirements and anti-money laundering screening requirements. As part of that, there's what we call a negative news screening, as well as sort of certain types of data screening, where banks, if you're bringing on a customer, you have sort of an ongoing monitoring process that's automatic that monitors news sources for negative news. In my report, we talk about a company called DEXP, where it had a bank account at HSBC Hong Kong, and last year in the Epoch Times, there was an article about DEXP and its potential involvement with Russian trade. Within days, company's registry records showed HSBC had essentially canceled that account. As far as we can tell, we don't have all the data. Probably related, right? So what would have likely happened there is that the automatic processes at HSBC would have seen that Epoch Times article, and it would have flagged it, and they would have said, okay, we have KYC money laundering issues here. We're going to have to cancel this account and get rid of this customer. And by the way, that's great for HSBC, and I think that's good to see. But with that said, then you say, okay, I can, through C4ADS or through other organizations, get access to these trade records. I can get access to companies' registry documents. I can get access to all these things with a little bit more effort. As far as I'm aware, there could be banks that do this, but none that we're aware of. Banks don't look at this stuff. And so recommendation 5 is saying they should. Again, I talked about at the beginning, the world has changed in a way where just hard data and spreadsheets are way more important than they used to be. This stuff is available out there. And so I think what we want to push for with companies is that they are looking more at more actively at some of these data sources that they, instead of just passively waiting for things to be reported on in order to nip this in the bud. The other side of that is that we need more enforcement by US government, EU enforcement agencies and prosecutors against companies when over due diligence programs. So traditionally, right, sanctions exports control, there's a strict liability there if there's a violation. But typically you won't go after a company if they have a sufficient due diligence program in place. But the government has a lot of power to kind of shift the requirements there. I mean, they can say, look, your due diligence program maybe 2 years ago, it was okay, but we're looking at it now, we don't think it is. So we're going to bring in enforcement action. So there's sort of both sides of that. Companies stepping up to be more proactive in finding these things. Enforcement agencies making an example of a few companies to make sure that every other bank, every other company really starts doing more due diligence. When it comes to the chip companies, to your question about what kind of due diligence to do, the chip companies say, well, we don't ship to Hong Kong. We can't really control where our stuff goes. To some extent, that's always going to be true. And we're not saying that every one of these should be enforced, right? But there's a lot more that they can do. These chip companies, these high-tech companies, they need to be sending teams out of the country to their distributors, doing audits without warning. They need to be spending significantly more money to make sure that they are able to go in and track where these things are ultimately going after they ship them out. I will say that that's a lot harder for a company like Texas Instruments, where they just mass produce really, really cheap semiconductors. There's just so many of them out there. But it's not that difficult for some of the more expensive high-tech ones where they're producing more specialized things, fewer products for higher prices. They need to be doing more, and it's that side that is really the most dangerous as well, and the things that are most desired, these really expensive ones.
Yeah.
I'm just really glad that you asked this question, because I think a lot of our conversation has centered around government enforcement and how governments should respond to illicit activity in Hong Kong. But corporations, particularly American companies, have a responsibility to know what their risks are. And while I don't think anyone on this panel is saying that there isn't any legitimate business happening in Hong Kong, as Hong Kong's market becomes increasingly polluted by illicit activities, companies have to know that they are increasing their risk over time of falling under both international and American scrutiny of broader sanctions regimes. And I know for a fact that will matter to corporate America, that will matter to Fortune 500 companies around the globe, that they may potentially face sanctions because that has implications for their bottom line. And so I think that's why we should be caring about this, not just from a government standpoint, but also from a corporate standpoint too. And hopefully more folks will start waking up, because we've seen way too many top leaders of American companies and global companies going to Hong Kong and essentially doing the propaganda bidding of John Lee and of Beijing and saying it's fine, it's business as usual, and that has got to end. And I think Sam's report is really going to help shed light on that, and hopefully we will see change in response.
Yeah, and also to answer your question regarding whether or not we should de-risk Hong Kong, I think absolutely yes. And I think the reason for that is if we, especially perhaps the US government, they don't try to encourage allies or countries around the world to understand the dire situation in Hong Kong right now, I think that will be very problematic in several ways. First of all, I think the Hong Kong government has been using a lot of active measure and also very aggressively trying to use Hong Kong as an international financial hub to portray so many critical infrastructures and also ports in different countries. If you ask any people here in this town who focus on China and Latin American relationship, they can tell you that, or perhaps people in the DoD, in the Southern Command, they will also discern that since perhaps several years ago, a lot of Hong Kong companies that at least on the surface listed in Hong Kong, they portray ports in Brazil, Mexico, Peru, And then despite Latin America, even for countries like Poland. And then I think NATO is also quite concerned about that. And Hong Kong businessmen have been using their international financial status, right? To portray different kind of stuff. And this kind of strategic areas can further help Hong Kong to build more shell companies and shelters in order to portray and try to further ship other materials through different regions and countries very easily. And I think this is very alarming. So I think it's very important when we talk about corporates should do their due diligence. I think countries themselves should also do their due diligence to understand that Hong Kong is no longer Hong Kong. So I think US should play a more role to that, to mobilize their allies and other countries to ensure that Hong Kong cannot be somewhere like that anymore. And countries should try to also prohibit Hong Kong companies to portray their strategic critical infrastructure and ports for other purposes. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, if the answers are brief.
Hi, Dan Flatley with Bloomberg News. I wanted to ask about your suggestion about sanctioning banks. The Biden administration has so far been reluctant to sanction Chinese banks, even though they've been signaling that that is on the table. Do you see something that would indicate that there is now more willingness to take that step? And would there be a change, if there's a change in presidential administrations here in the US, do you see a future Trump or potentially Harris administration being more willing to take that step?
Yeah, there was the last round of sanctions where they did sanction some Hong Kong companies and addresses as they'd done before. The press release from the government was funny because it started out by saying, this round of sanctions, it was something like, this round of sanctions increases the risk that banks will be sanctioned, which was a very weird way of talking about something that only they can do. And I think they've been very clear about wanting to sort of signal this as a threat. On your question of whether I see this as more likely now, I'm actually, some of the initial kind of reaction, I'm actually concerned that the opposite might be true. That with this report, they might be kind of buckling down somewhat on saying, well, there's been a reduction in 2024. I think it's really important to push back on that for media, for us here, and to ask to really see the numbers there, whether this is a trend overall in the world, how big of a reduction it is, because ultimately there is still a massive number of ships and high technology going from Hong Kong to Russia, and frankly, it's naive to think that the Chinese government is going to do what the US government wants it to do on this without a stick. And that stick is sanctioning banks, among others. With regard to the political question, look, I think it's hard to know exactly what the administrations will do. I think we'd probably see a continuation of policies with a Harris administration. For the Trump administration, I think we might see a shift where there might be more focus on Iran, which is a big focus of our report. Probably North Korea, there would still be some focus there. I'm concerned about Russia and some of the things that have been said there. What I would say to the Trump team is, uncertainty in this area is not helpful to anyone. Whatever that administration's position would be on Russia sanctions, I would really encourage them to get it out in paper in detail well before the election so that everybody is sort of prepared for it. We need predictability in this. We need to understand what's going to happen, whatever it is.
Great. I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. As Olivia mentioned, we've got several reports on the credenza to the side of the room. Please pick up a copy, and we're available for questions afterwards and at any time. Thanks so much.
And please grab one.